The chickens hadn't laid in days. The wind had snapped the clothesline again. And the cradle creaked empty while Rosie dragged a broom handle through the dust like a staff twice her size, chasing shadows only 4-year-olds could see. Mabel squinted toward the horizon from her porch, one hip cocked to balance Elliot in his sling, her arm gone numb from the weight she no longer noticed. That morning had begun like all others, tight-throated silence, a broken gate swaying, and the smell of milk gone sour. She didn't want a man. She wanted a miracle. The ranch, once 30 acres of wheat and creek-fed pasture, now whispered of surrender. The barn leaned like an old drunk toward the west, and the corral gate hung one hinge shy of quitting. Mabel's boots were split along the soles, but she still walked straight, spine pulled tight by pride and routine. Her face, soft once, had the kind of hollowness that comes when grief becomes manageable but never smaller. Elliot stirred, and she pressed a kiss to his head, breathing in the sour-sweet scent of infant skin. Her body was still healing from his birth, the way women's bodies always seem to break to save what men left behind. She hadn't cried in 6 weeks. There wasn't time. She crossed the threshold into her kitchen, where sunlight slanted through slats and danced on dust motes. A folded paper lay on the counter. The sheriff's seal pressed into red wax. She didn't need to open it. The message was always the same: 1 more week. Rosie sat on the floor with a bent tin soldier, trying to get him to stand upright on one leg. "Mama, does he need a friend?" Mabel crouched beside her. "He needs balance, baby. Friends help, but they can't stand for you." The girl nodded solemnly, as though the sentence was scripture. Mabel tucked the letter into her apron. She could read it later. Or burn it. By noon, she'd loaded Rosie onto the wagon seat with a patched shawl and swaddled Elliot against her chest. The ride into town was dusty, her skirt catching wind like a sail torn through. She kept her head down past the white church, past the mill, past Mrs. Castor's porch, where gossip dangled from the laundry lines like prize-winning linens. She heard it all in glances, the pity, the suspicion, the delight in watching someone beautiful crumble under the weight of their own pride. She hadn't always been alone. There was once a man named Everett. Broad-chested and loud-laughed, who built her the porch swing and named Rosie after his mother. Then a fever came for him like a debt collector. Gone in 2 nights. Elliot hadn't even had a name yet. Mabel stopped the wagon beside the general store, lifted Rosie down, and brushed her daughter's tangled hair with fingers more used to wire and nails than combs. "Stay close." Inside, the air smelled of spice, leather, and overripe apples. Mabel bought oats with 2 coins and an apology, then asked for nails. The clerk, a boy barely shaving, looked like he pitied her too much to charge full price. Outside, Rosie tugged at her sleeve. "Mama, that man's starin' dot." Across the street stood Sheriff Boone, clean hat, pressed coat, and eyes that could gut a person without ever raising his voice. He tipped his hat. Mabel didn't return it. But he still crossed. "Miss Whitlock," he said, voice buttered with that town sheriff calm. "Word is the bank sent its final notice." She held Rosie tighter. "I'm aware." He adjusted his belt, leaned against the post like he belonged to it. "A woman alone can't hold land like that forever." "No offense." "Then don't speak it. You could marry, you know." His eyes flicked toward Rosie, then Elliot. "For the children's sake." The tone in his voice made her stomach turn. Not cruel. Worse, gentle. Like charity offered with expectations. "I'll find a way," she said, then walked away before her courage turned brittle. Mabel didn't stop at the bank or the sheriff's office. She stopped at the saloon, where cards flickered between palms and whiskey sloshed like liquid gold. She stepped in with a heart tight as a noose and looked for the corkboard near the stairs. Dozens of yellowed papers. She reached into her pocket, pulled a folded square she'd written that morning with shaking hands, and tacked it up. Man needed. No questions. Room and board. Must be strong, quiet, and honest. Duration, 3 months. She left before anyone could read it. Before anyone could offer what she didn't want to buy. As she mounted the wagon and cracked the reins, she didn't look back. Rosie rested her head against her shoulder. Elliot slept in silence. The ride home felt longer than the ride there. That night, the prairie wind howled through the cracks in the shutters. Mabel tucked the children in, swept the hearth twice though it was already clean, and stared into the fire. She wanted to cry. Instead, she whispered into the silence, "I don't want a man. I want someone who leaves the door open when they leave." Outside, a rider watched from the dark edge of her land. He was dressed in plain leather, with a blanket folded behind his saddle and eyes that missed nothing. He said nothing. He simply watched. The fire's glow flickered against her window, and he saw the curve of her back as she bent to lift a bucket. Her hair had fallen loose, a soft gold even in the dark. He watched long enough to be certain she wasn't looking for a man to save her. She was trying to bury herself quietly before the world noticed she was drowning. By the time Mabel blew out the lantern, the horse and rider were gone. But in the barn, a rope had been coiled, a hinge mended, and 3 split fence rails stacked neat as folded letters. The next morning, Mabel woke to Rosie whispering, "Mama, someone fixed the barn." Mabel opened the door and saw prints, moccasin-shaped, leading to the well, then back to the road. She stepped out barefoot, wind curling at her hem, her son fussing against her chest. The prairie stretched quiet and wide, but the prints told her something no man in town ever had. Someone had listened. And maybe, just maybe, someone was coming. The wind came from the south that morning, warmer than usual, but carrying the smell of burnt mesquite. Mabel stood at the edge of her porch, a pail in one hand and Elliot sleeping against her breast, when she saw the figure on horseback rise from the dip beyond the pasture. He wasn't riding fast, nor slow, just steady, like he wasn't in a hurry but had nowhere else to be. She narrowed her eyes. Rosie peeked from behind her skirts. The man wore no hat. His hair was dark, loose at the shoulders, his shoulders wrapped in a tan blanket the color of dry clay. Across his chest, a bow, slung neat. No rifle. No badge. No questions in his eyes, only a quiet that reached ahead of him. Mabel didn't move. She didn't call out. She didn't dare hope. He stopped at the broken corral, slid off the saddle in one motion, and stood as if he belonged to the dirt itself. Then he looked up at her, just once, and nodded. "You answered it," she said, heart slow and cold like she was saying it in a dream. The man walked forward, stopped 6 feet short of the porch. Rosie clung to her leg. "I'm Mabel Whitlock," she said, straightening. "This is my land." He said nothing. "I can't offer wages. Room and board. 3 months. Still no answer. Then finally, his voice, low and calm. "I'll take the barn." She blinked. "You Apache?" He gave no name. Only said, "I've lived colder." She gestured toward the path, chin raised as if daring herself to be unafraid. "Well. Tools are behind the coop. Water's from the well." He nodded again, like he already knew. Then turned and walked toward the barn, leading his horse by the bridle. No saddlebag, just a bedroll and a small bundle tied with leather cord. Rosie whispered, "Mama, what's his name?" "I don't know yet." That day, the stranger said nothing else. But by sundown, the south fence stood straighter. Mabel saw it from her window while feeding Elliot and watching Rosie fall asleep curled next to a stuffed cloth rabbit. The man hadn't come inside. She hadn't offered. But she'd left half a loaf of cornbread on the porch rail, wrapped in linen. In the morning, it was gone. On the 3rd day, Rosie brought him water. He took it gently from her with a nod and drank beside her in the field. She returned with cheeks pink and eyes wide. He said thank you, she whispered. That night, Mabel lit the lantern late, just to listen to the silence. It had changed. Not quieter, but steadier. Like someone had fixed the rhythm. By the end of the first week, he'd mended every hinge, stacked the firewood better than she ever had, and cleared the ditch that overflowed during spring thaw. Still, no name. She tried not to ask questions. She told herself she didn't want to know. But she noticed how he paused before every task, how he never touched the house unless invited. When Elliot cried, he never looked toward the sound, as if respecting her sorrows like territory. When Rosie spoke, he listened fully, not as if amused, but as if learning the world through her voice. In town, the questions began the moment she tied up the wagon for flour and oil. "Who's the red man on your porch? Is he your new husband? Or just keeping the bed warm?" Mabel said nothing. Mrs. Castor narrowed her eyes and said, "You could have chosen better." "I didn't choose," Mabel said softly, "I needed help." Sheriff Boone asked about him the next day outside the post office, his mouth curled in friendly concern. "You sure that man of yours is trustworthy?" Mabel didn't flinch. "He doesn't drink. Doesn't gossip. Doesn't cheat at cards. That's more than I can say for some who wear stars." Boone's face didn't change. But the smile never touched his eyes after that. Back home, she found Rosie and the stranger side by side near the orchard. Rosie held a basket, he pointed to herbs she could pick without harm. When Mabel approached, he stood, respectful. Rosie beamed. "Mama, he knows medicine." Mabel glanced at him. "Do you?" "I know what was passed down." "From your mother?" He paused, then gave her a name, Caton. It hung between them, more gift than admission. Mabel repeated it aloud once, soft on her tongue. He gave no smile, only nodded. That night, while the children slept, she found him near the paddock, sharpening an axe. She brought him tea in a chipped mug, her fingers brushing his briefly. Neither spoke. The air between them held more warmth than the fire. She meant to return inside. But she sat down on the step beside him. "The house is quiet with him gone," she said, staring out toward the fence line. "Everett." Caton said nothing. But the stillness between them invited more. "I married him young. He was kind. Loud. A dreamer. He promised me fence posts and peach trees and a big tin bath. He gave me Rosie. Then a cough. Then a box." Caton's eyes didn't shift from the dark. Mabel's voice cracked once, then steadied. "Elliot was born on the floor of the kitchen. I bit through a towel. Rosie held my hand. There wasn't even time to boil water." Caton stared ahead, but his jaw twitched, like a man holding something he didn't want seen. "I buried my first daughter under that apple tree," she added, voice dry as straw. 3 days old. Cold took her. A pause. "My brother," he said, "stepped between me and a bullet. That was the last of my people I saw that year." Mabel looked at him then, really looked. "Why'd you come here?" He didn't answer. The moonlight hit his scars then, just barely visible along his collarbone, healed but rough. He caught her gaze and didn't look away. His silence said more than apology or promises could. She stood. "I'll leave the porch unlocked. If the wind kicks up." He nodded once. "Good night, Mabel." She walked inside. Her chest felt tight, but not from fear. The next morning, Rosie ran to her bed with excitement. "He made me a doll chair. Out of twigs. Look." Mabel took the little creation in her hand. It was perfect. Delicate. Balanced. She opened the door. Caton was already at the well, sleeves rolled, hands calloused. He didn't look back. But the quiet he carried filled the yard like morning fog. It was still too soon to call it safety. But it wasn't danger. It was something else. Something steadier. Something not yet named. And for the first time in weeks, Mabel exhaled like she meant to survive. The wind turned colder the morning of the barn dance. Rosie pressed her face to the window, her breath fogging the pane, and whispered, "Will he come with us?" Mabel didn't answer right away. She tied her hair back with a pale ribbon, the only one she hadn't mended twice, and stared at her reflection in the warped glass. She hadn't worn her blue calico in months, it fit a little tighter across the ribs, her body still soft from Elliot's birth. She brushed her hands down her hips and looked over her shoulder where Caton sat carving something by the hearth. His quiet presence had become part of the house now, like the smell of bread, or the sound of Rosie singing to herself while feeding chickens. "I didn't ask," Mabel said, smoothing the fabric again. "And I won't make him." When Rosie turned back to her doll, Caton's voice came softly. "Do you want me to?" Mabel looked up. His eyes held no pressure, no assumption. Just calm readiness. "I think you'd hate it," she said. "I would," he replied without apology, "but I'll come if it protects you." She shook her head. "You've done enough of that already." The wagon ride into town was quieter than usual. Rosie was dressed in her best, a hand-me-down pinafore that used to belong to a neighbor's child, one Mabel had nursed after her own mother died. Elliot was wrapped tight against her chest, dozing, oblivious to the whispers that would come once they reached town. The barn stood at the edge of town square, lanterns strung high and catching the dusk like fireflies trapped in glass. Fiddle music bled from the open doors, warm and reedy, and the air smelled of hay and molasses. As Mabel stepped down, she felt eyes like brambles, catching, tearing. Sheriff Boone stood near the entrance, talking low with the banker, his silver star gleaming beneath the lantern light. Inside, the mood shifted. Women nodded politely, then turned away too quickly. Men smiled too long. Mrs. Castor offered a tight-lipped greeting and a glance at Elliot that said more than words could. Mabel danced once out of obligation, not pleasure, with a schoolteacher who smelled of ink and sweat. Rosie played in the corner with other children, her laughter bright and echoing above the music. Then Boone approached. He didn't ask. Just stepped forward and extended his hand like she owed him something. She took it to avoid a scene. His palm was dry and commanding. He spun her too fast, his breath close. "You look better than you have in a while," he said. "The man working your land, what's his name?" Mabel kept her face neutral. "Caton." "That Apache?" "Just a man." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Mabel, this town won't tolerate you making trouble." "I'm not." "You will be. If you're not careful." He stopped dancing before the music ended, tipped his hat like he'd just said something kind, and disappeared into the crowd. Mabel stood still, her stomach cold. Her chest felt tight, not from exertion, but from shame that wasn't hers to carry. Rosie appeared then, clutching her doll with tears brimming. "Mama, can we go?" Mabel bent down. "What happened?" "I don't like it here. People talk strange. I miss Caton." Mabel nodded, lifted Elliot, and took Rosie's hand. They walked back to the wagon in silence. The road home was darker than usual, the stars hidden behind clouds. Somewhere in the brush, a coyote yipped, and Rosie leaned into her side. Caton was waiting when they arrived, oil lamp lit beside him, seated on the porch step, sharpening a blade with steady rhythm. He rose when he saw them. Mabel stepped down and said nothing at first. Then, "You were right to stay." He didn't ask what happened. Just took Elliot from her arms so she could lift Rosie more easily. Inside, the children were laid down, the house quiet. Caton stepped outside again, and she followed, standing beside him in the cool dark. "I think they'd like to see me crawl," she whispered. "They'd feed my babies bread laced with pity and call it kindness." "They do not see you." She looked up at him. "Do you?" He hesitated, then reached for something in his coat pocket. Her fingers flinched, but he only held out a small, carved wooden horse no larger than a walnut. Rosie's name was etched into the base in Apache script. "I see you work," he said. "I see you lift your boy with one hand while hammering a fence rail with the other. I see the way you protect your daughter with only a glance. And I know what it looks like to carry grief so long you stop calling it grief." Mabel felt the lump rise, unexpected and painful. "I'm not looking for love," she said. "I didn't ask for it," he replied. They stood like that a while, two silhouettes against the sky, stars flickering back into focus. A breeze rolled up from the south again, stirring the grass and lifting the hem of her dress. She didn't move when his fingers brushed her hand. It wasn't possessive. Just present. Later, when she lay awake with Elliot pressed to her chest, she listened to the steady thud of Caton's axe outside, clearing storm-felled branches near the field. She thought of Boone's touch, and then Caton's stillness. Not all men want to own you. Some just want to see if you'll let them stay. She closed her eyes and slept before the moon reached its peak. The storm broke just after sundown. It wasn't the kind that announced itself with lightning and sky theatrics. It came low and cold, pushing across the prairie like an accusation, slipping under doors and into bones. Mabel heard it before she felt it, heard it in the distant groan of pine and the uneasy rustle of the animals in the shed. Elliot, who'd been fussy all afternoon, grew hot in her arms. His skin burned against her collarbone. His tiny fists curled in panic. She tried cool cloths, breast milk, her mother's old willow bark remedy. Nothing settled him. Caton came in from the barn with damp hair and a fresh bundle of split wood. His eyes found hers instantly, saw what words hadn't said. She didn't need to ask. He stepped to her side, touched Elliot's forehead, then gently took the boy into his arms as if he'd done it all his life. "He's burning," he said. "I know," Mabel whispered. "I know." By midnight, Elliot's cries were thin and high, and Rosie, sleepless and frightened, clutched her rag doll in the corner, eyes wide as stormlight. Mabel wrapped her son in 3 blankets and cinched her boots tight. "I have to get the doctor." Caton moved to block her. "He won't come." "He has to." "He won't." "Not with me here." She stared at him. "Then I'll go without you." Caton didn't argue. He simply opened the door and stood aside. The wind hit her like a slap. Rain pelted sideways. She climbed into the wagon, reins trembling in her hands, and didn't look back. The ride to town was a blur of wet trees, sloshing mud, and the sound of Elliot's shallow breathing in her memory. The sheriff's office lantern still burned. She passed it. She passed the church. She passed every building where folks had judged her dress, her children, her choices. The doctor's door was bolted. She banged on it, again and again, until a curtain twitched and a pale, pinched face appeared. "Please," she said, "my boy has a fever, he's not breathing right." He opened the door but stayed behind it. "Is the Apache still on your land?" Mabel didn't answer. "You need to bring the child here." "I don't treat house calls where there's threat." Mabel stepped back, coldness rising through her spine like ink in water. "He's not a threat." The door shut. She rode home in the dark. She didn't cry. She gritted her teeth until her gums ached. The mud soaked through her skirts and the rains tore skin from her palms. When she pulled into the yard, the lantern was burning on the porch. Caton waited. She climbed down, numb, wordless. He took one look at her and said nothing. Just stepped inside. Elliot's cries were weaker now. Caton knelt beside the fire and opened a pouch she hadn't seen before. Leaves, roots, a powdered clay she couldn't name. His fingers moved with confidence, with reverence. He boiled water, mixed the herbs, soaked a cloth, placed it over the boy's belly. "What is it?" she whispered. "A medicine my grandmother taught. The fever must be drawn out, not drowned." Mabel knelt beside him. "Do you think it will work?" "I think it must." Rosie climbed into her lap, trembling. "Is he going to die?" Mabel held her tightly. "Not if we can help it." The hours that followed passed in flickers, steam rising off Elliot's skin, Caton's hands never leaving him, Rosie finally falling asleep curled beneath Caton's old blanket, the storm battering the walls like fists from the sky itself. At dawn, Elliot breathed easier. The heat broke with a gasp and a cry, a strong one, desperate and familiar. Mabel sank to the floor, both hands over her face, and wept. Caton leaned back, drenched in sweat not his own, and nodded once. "He will be all right." She reached across the space and took his hand. They sat in silence, the weight of what didn't happen pressing down harder than any danger ever could. In that quiet, something shifted. Later that afternoon, after the rain had gone and the sky was trying to pretend nothing had happened, Mabel stood at the porch with a fresh basin of water and watched Caton tie up the horses. The land looked soft and wet, the air full of birdsong. "Why did you really come?" she asked him. Caton turned slowly. "Because I heard a woman trying not to drown. And I've drowned before." She nodded. "Then, I told Boone no." "When?" "When he offered to help if you left." Caton didn't smile. But his eyes softened. "I didn't want a man," she said, voice quieter now. "I wanted help. But now I don't know if that's all I need." He came closer, but didn't touch her. "You don't need to know yet," he said. "I'm not leaving." That night, he moved his bedroll to the porch. Not inside, but closer. Mabel didn't protest. The next morning, Rosie ran out with her arms wide, and Caton lifted her without hesitation. She squealed with joy and clung to his neck like it had always been hers to hold. From the kitchen window, Mabel watched them, the tall man with sun-dark skin and the little girl in a cotton shift with mismatched socks. Elliot slept in her arms, his breath warm and steady. The ranch still needed paint. The barn still leaned. The letters from the bank still came. But something was different now. Something steady. Something earned. And though the fence still sagged in places, she no longer felt like she was the only thing holding it all together. It began with the quietest of mornings. Mabel woke to the sound of Rosie's laughter outside, light, unguarded, the kind of sound she hadn't heard in months. Elliot stirred in his cradle beside the stove, stretching tiny limbs like saplings unfurling after rain. Sunlight spilled across the floorboards, golden and sure, touching the worn furniture like an old friend. She tied back her hair, stepped into her boots, and paused at the door. On the porch, Caton was teaching Rosie to braid horsehair. She sat cross-legged, tongue between her teeth, determined and precise. He sat beside her, patient, fingers moving with the same gentleness he used when tending the newborn calf or holding Elliot through fever. Mabel stepped into the light. He looked up. Their eyes met, and for a long moment, there were no needs to speak. The moment didn't last. Around midday, dust rolled up the lane thick, rising fast, unnatural. A wagon approached, flanked by two men on horseback. At the center sat Sheriff Boone, posture stiff, his eyes already narrowed before the wheel stopped. Mabel stood in the yard with Caton beside her. Rosie clung to her skirt. Elliot slept in the sling. Boone climbed down like he'd come to measure the land with his boots. "Mabel Whitlock," he said, pulling a folded paper from his coat. "As of this morning, the county board has ruled your land improperly claimed. Without a legal male relative or husband named on deed, it's eligible for auction. Your failure to settle bank dues sealed the matter." Mabel didn't blink. "And you think you're the first man to try and take what I built with my bare hands?" Boone's smile was cold. "I'm just the one who brought the law to back it." Caton stepped forward, calm as a rising wind. "This is her home. And I won't let you shame her here." Boone's hand went to the butt of his revolver. "That a threat?" "It's a promise of presence," Caton said. "Not every man has to raise his voice to mean it." Boone looked at Mabel again. "You've got until sundown to clear the house." "I'm already married," Mabel said. The words left her lips without hesitation, as if the truth had been there all along, waiting for breath. Boone scoffed. "Married? To who?" Caton reached into his pocket, pulled out a slip of paper sealed with pine resin and ash, a tribal certificate, signed 2 days ago under the eyes of a respected elder who'd come down from the hills. Mabel took it, held it out. "To him," she said, steady as thunder before a storm. "By Apache right. And by choice." Boone took the paper but didn't read it. "Not recognized by our courts." "You speak of law like it's holy," Caton said quietly. "But law without honor is just a cage." A crowd had begun to gather near the fence, neighbors, passers-by, townsfolk with gossip already rising in their throats. Mrs. Castor stood behind the fence rail, arms crossed, her face unreadable. The wind pressed silence into the space between breaths. Then, from the crowd, a voice rose, "She's raised them babies alone longer than most wives keep their men sober." Another, "That Apache's done more good for her land than 5 of our own sons." Boone looked around, the shift beginning to show in his posture. He hadn't expected resistance. Least of all from the town itself. Mrs. Castor stepped forward, her voice like gravel wrapped in linen. She deserves to stay. She deserves peace. Boone's jaw clenched. He folded the paper once, twice, shoved it into his coat, and turned. Fine. But don't think you've earned your place. This won't last. Mabel called after him. Nothing lasts, Sheriff. But some things live on just the same. When the dust finally settled, Rosie ran to Caton. He caught her with one arm and held her high. She grinned like the world had tipped back into sunlight. Mabel walked toward him slowly, Elliot asleep against her chest, her dress catching in the breeze. She touched his hand, then his jaw. Not a kiss. Just truth. Later that night, Caton lit a fire behind the house. They all sat near it, Mabel, Rosie, Elliot in her arms, Caton beside them with his hands open and bare. The flames danced like memory. Rosie leaned her head against his shoulder. Are you gonna stay forever? I don't know what forever is, he said. But I know I'm not going. Mabel looked at the man beside her, not as a stranger hired in desperation, but as the one who never once asked for more than she could give, yet gave more than she ever thought she'd receive. You were never a hired hand, she whispered. No, he said, I was just waiting to be yours. The fire cracked once, sharp and warm. And somewhere in the night, the wind changed. No longer biting, no longer cruel. Just soft, and full of promise. The land still bore scars. So did they. But something had taken root here now, between mended fences, warm silence, and the space left for one another's grief. Not the love of fairy tales or declarations, but of shared weight, earned trust, and open doors. Some love stories didn't arrive on white horses. Some arrived on tired feet, without words, bearing only wood, calm hands, and a name given slowly. And those were the ones that stayed. Because sometimes, the husband you never meant to find becomes the home you never knew you deserved.